This is Jeff Healy here in Hamilton, and just under the wire I made it to introduce probably my favorite Canadian speaker, Dr. Brent Mitchell from the University of Calgary. And to be honest, if anyone on the webinar wants to learn how to give a good presentation, how to captivate an audience, you're going to learn from the master today. Brent's always held my attention when I see him give a talk. He can get complex issues across in a very easy way where you feel you actually haven't spent any effort learning, and always with some entertainment and self-deprecating humor. So Brent, thanks very much for taking the time out of your day to enlighten our constituents.
Shall I begin?
You should.
All right. So yes, thank you for that very kind introduction, Jeff. The topic of the CSPN webinar today is Pearls of Public Speaking. That's not an easy topic to summarize, but I'll see what I can do. Firstly, know this. You must be an accomplished public speaker. Why? Because your success depends upon it. If you study the differences between national and international leaders in any field, that is the differences between them and those who are not national or international leaders in any field, you will find that that which separates them from the also-rans is a capacity for public speaking. You must become good at public speaking, or in its stead you will accept being mediocre. Do I have your attention? Pearl 1 of public speaking then is start with a bang. Most of your audience has decided whether or not they are going to listen to you within the first minutes of your presentation. Some have argued that there's an advantage to having a crescendo in your presentation, but I would suggest that you need to begin with a bang, and for that matter, end with a bang if you wish your transmission to be memorable. I've heard it said after some presentations, well, he was just after the entertainment value, and I didn't learn that much. That usually means that the member of the audience who is speaking in that way was entertained and probably already knew everything that was going to try to be transmitted. But I firmly believe that one must be entertaining if one is to be a good public speaker. There are many ways to be entertaining. You must find the one that works for you. You can be humorous, you can be astonishing, you can be outrageous, you can tell stories, you can challenge, you can play games, you can even provide fascinating and useless statistics. That tends to be what some people remember from your presentation. My own personal favorite that I've used many times is the most children born to a woman was 64. She had 16 twins, 7 triplets, and 4 quadruplets by the age of 40. Or you could give interesting quotes, and you'll see that I'll do that a few times. Whatever you do, though, you must be entertaining. Despite the ancillary need to be entertaining, in order to be an accomplished speaker, it is also important to have something to say. Shown here is a great orator who had something to say. Martin Luther King was probably the greatest orator of our time. The pearl of public speaking referred to here, though, is probably still the easiest to achieve. The only danger in having something to say is that it might become the only goal of your presentation. That is acceptable for brief technical presentations such as an abstract presentation, but even then, a little entertainment distinguishes the successful from the also-ran. It requires that you refine your thoughts. By refine your thoughts, I mean prepare. Einstein, arguably the greatest thinker of the previous generation, well understood preparation. He said, if you cannot explain it simply, you do not understand it well enough. Another famous saying in that regard was one from Mark Twain, who was fond of saying that it usually took him about 3 weeks to prepare an impromptu speech. Just for fun, I once calculated how much time it took me to prepare for a presentation that I had never considered before, one that required research from the ground up. The presentation was entitled The History of Cardiac Electrophysiology, not something I had given a lot of thought to before preparing, so I kept track, and I found that it took 1 hour of preparation time for every minute of presentation time. Therefore, to be a successful public speaker, you must be prepared, and that preparation is going to take substantially more time than you actually think that it will. Once you are prepared, you must, of course, still master the details of your presentation. As is always the case, the devil is in the details. We will be spending most of our time today focusing on these details, as they are the skills that you must develop. However, at the moment I am attempting to paint a broader picture. We'll return momentarily to mastering the details with Yoda's help. The final broad stroke pearl of public speaking is that you can only develop the skills that you need to be an accomplished speaker through practice. Practice, practice, and more practice. Avail yourself of every opportunity to present to a diversity of publics, and you too will become an accomplished public speaker. At this point, I remind you of pearl number 1. You must become an accomplished public speaker if your career goals include being a national or international leader in your field. So get out there and practice all that you can. Meanwhile, let us return to mastering the details. Firstly, you must be a master of your subject matter. In that regard, it is imperative to know more about the subject matter that you are presenting than does anyone else in your audience. I've been a fan of visual cartoonists all my life. Among one of my favorites is Scott Adams, he who creates Dilbert cartoons, for the wisdom that they impart. In this cartoon, homage is paid to the need to master your subject matter. Narrow the field of your subject matter, however far you need to narrow it, until you can be its master, knowing more than anyone else in your audience. I do recognize that it will occasionally be true that the best you can achieve is to know as much as your audience, but it's far, far better to try to know more than anyone that is in the audience. As an aside, although you should know all you can know about your subject matter, you should never attempt to transmit all of that knowledge in one presentation. Attempting to do so invariably causes the critical trees to be lost in the proverbial forest. That is to say, it is not your job to try to transmit in an oral presentation everything that you know. And in fact, that goal should be avoided at all costs. In consideration of organizing your subject matter, one tenet of public speaking is to have an introduction, about 3 sections of information, and an extroduction, which is very often just a repeat of the introduction in a conclusion-forming way. While we have a slide up that has a cartoon on it, it's worth mentioning that if you choose to use this kind of cartoon, it must be relevant to the subject matter at the moment. Otherwise, it's just a distraction. And further along that line, in addition to Scott Adams and his Dilbert, I recommend highly to your use Gary Unger and his Herman cartoons. Both of them have a lot of insight into either management or the practice of medicine that can be worked into a great number of different presentations. Finally, before leaving the topic of subject matter, it is important to realize that the biggest error that a public speaker can make is going over the allotted time. Ensure that this never happens. I've heard it said before that one should have one slide for each minute of presentation. I can tell you from experience that that is too many slides. And I usually try to use only 3/4 of that number. That is to say, if I'm going to try to talk for 20 minutes, 15 slides is the perfect number. If I'm going to try to talk for 10 minutes, as in an abstract, 8 works better. Once you've mastered the subject matter, the mechanism of its transmission requires that you also have an excellent understanding of the composition of your audience. To provide an effective delivery, you must know who they are and preferably what they want. With knowledge regarding your audience, a presentation can be planned and delivered that engages the audience. In this regard, the worst mistake is to talk down to an audience. Nevertheless, the magnitude of this mistake is nearly matched by speaking at a level that the audience could not possibly understand. An example of the latter would be speaking in medical lexicon to an audience of laypersons. Obviously, a proper balance must be struck. I also prefer to try to engage the audience. You can engage the audience in a number of different ways that I'll pose in a few moments, but the best way to do that is to try to ensure that their questions are being answered as you go along. Now that can't be accomplished very easily on a webinar, but in a live audience, or with a live audience, the best kind of presentation at all, you can tell when people are looking quizzical. You can engage them by asking for their question and answer it then. It brings them into the fold. By the way, when a question does come from the audience, always repeat the question before answering it. Then everybody knows what the question was. It goes without saying that to be an effective public speaker, one must be a master of the language that is to be used in that presentation. Since I can only speak one language to my great shame, the slide says the English language, but really it's whatever language your audience is prepared to receive. Although that language could indeed be any language, in our environment, the national and international leaders must master the English language. For that part, mastery is achieved by reading the works of accomplished articles or authors and by watching and listening to accomplished speakers. The former are found in libraries. The latter are most easily found by watching TED Talks. These are 15-minute presentations given on matters that matter by the best speakers on earth. You can find TED Talks on the internet, and you can also find them on Netflix. In that regard, it's worth noting that having an accent is not only not a detriment, it may even be an advantage. Arguably, the best speaker in clinical cardiac electrophysiology today is Professor John Cam, who fosters a pronounced, traditional, educated Englishman language. Listen to his presentations whenever you get the chance. They are the epitome of effective use of the English language and the effective use of logic. On the other hand, I would also advise that you never accept an invitation to debate him. Most public presentations today use the PowerPoint slide. My advice to you is to master the PowerPoint program. Trust me, you will be judged, at least in part, by the quality of your slides. So make sure they're the best that you can make them. PowerPoint slides have the capacity to endow you with the characteristics of logic, foresight, expertise, and leadership. On the other hand, PowerPoint slides can also have the capacity to make you look like a stupid idiot. The only way to foster the former and to avoid the latter is to make the slides yourself. Doing so allows you absolute control over their content, ensures that you are familiar with their details. There's nothing worse than saying, I'm not quite sure what that asterisk means on this slide. And lastly, it also fosters organization of your thoughts. In the process of preparing a presentation, simultaneously making the PowerPoint slides forces you to organize what you plan to say. As an aside, though, never use a PowerPoint slide with a company's logo. Doing so endows you with the characteristics of a salesman, and that destroys your credibility. Never apologize for a bad slide. Fix it. Many of you have seen this kind of slide pop up, and usually the speaker apologizes in some way for the busy slide and then draws your attention to the things that are in the red boxes. If you want to impart this information to me clearly, just give me the information in the little boxes. Another tenet of public speaking is if you have to point to your slide using an arrow, a box, or a laser, then the slide is too complex. When you're presenting, it should be quite obvious to a member of your audience which portion of the slide you are currently talking to. Here, the red boxes identify the effects of 2 dosages of dabigatran in comparison to warfarin with respect to the primary efficacy outcome of systemic thromboembolism or stroke in RELY. When I present that data, I do it in this way. Firstly, we are going to talk about the primary stroke or primary efficacy outcome of stroke or systemic embolism in over 18,000 patients. Adjusted dose warfarin has a time course of the onset of that event or those events as illustrated with the green line, such that after a median follow-up of 24 months, 3% of participants randomized to warfarin and RELY had an outcome. The outcome on the lower dose of dabigatran is shown in the buff color, and it had a hazard ratio of 0.91 with 95% confidence interval limits as shown, not a statistically superior outcome, but statistically significantly not inferior to warfarin. The performance in this regard of the higher dose of dabigatran is shown in magenta. It had a hazard ratio for the primary efficacy outcome of 0.66, which provided a highly statistically significant reduction in the outcome of interest on this slide with respect to warfarin that was highly statistically significant. The very best public speaking performances involve a live audience. These performances usually involve the use of a room, an audio-visual assistant, and a podium that includes mechanical aids meant to improve your public speaking experience. Accordingly, it is also critically important to master these ancillary aids. Prior to approaching the podium for a public speaking activity, you should have already ensured that your slides present properly, that you know how to get to the podium, that you know how to work all the podium gizmos, and that you know the audio-visual assistant's name. One of the most certain ways to ensure prompt attention from an audio-visual assistant is to call him or her out by name. Of course, a very important determinant of the success of your public speaking engagement is your oratory style. Unfortunately, style cannot be taught. You must discover your own, and there are many. In my field, the best speakers and their styles are George Wise, who is indeed uncharacteristically wise, Dr. George Klein, whose style is based on being irreverent, Dr. Paul Dorian, whose style is based on self-depreciation, and both our host Jeff Healy and Dr. Andrew Cron, who apparently can simplify anything. My own style leans heavily on humor and visual effect. Again, I cannot say what your style should be, except to recommend against those things which clearly do not work. Altogether, far too often these days, a person begins a presentation by putting their head down, looking at their notes, and mumbling. This is what you should not do. You should connect with the audience, have eye contact with several of them at any given time, speak slowly, speak loudly, and speak with confidence. You can use notes if you wish, but you absolutely must not read them. I recently had the opportunity to introduce one of Canada's great orators at an after-dinner meeting, and I was astonished to see him arrive at the podium with 100 pages of paper typewritten. And on that typewritten paper were many different colors of ink with arrows and circles for emphasis. And I went, uh-oh. On the other hand, this very accomplished orator put the papers on the top of his podium and never touched them again, nor did he look at them for 1 second. Clearly, the papers were being used as a security blanket. If you must take notes to the podium, use them as a security blanket. It's also important to understand that pauses at just the right moment, followed by restatement, are often more powerful than words themselves. Try to have a conversation with the audience rather than give to them a speech. It's important to try to be confident, but don't push it to the envelope of arrogance. Have passion, but don't be entitled. That last bit translates into being excited. The more one seems to be excited about that which they are presenting, the more excitement they will generate in their audience. Humans don't know everything, so it is okay to be human and say there is something with respect to a topic that you don't know. That approach is far superior to trying to make up some statistic that you don't actually recall. Nevertheless, above all else, tell the truth as you know it, and try to engage the audience. Of course, it's also important to try to control your emotions and not be too nervous. The best way to control your emotions and to overcome fear of public speaking, in order to appear to be confident at least, is to practice over and over again. Over and over again. Nevertheless, you will never lose the sense of activation that comes with public speaking. I once asked George Klein if, after many years of functioning as a very highly accomplished public speaker, if he still got nervous before a presentation. He told me that he does not, but he replied that he still gets activated. Indeed, that sense of activation is for me addictive, such that public speaking and even the preparation for public speaking are amongst my favorite activities. Finally, I have been asked for advice on dress and grooming, that is, advice on appearance. Although it's probable that an accomplished speaker could pull off a great presentation wearing anything, except possibly nothing, a handy rule of thumb is to dress one station above that which is expected of the audience. If the audience is formally attired, then you need to be formally attired. If your audience is in business suits, you should be formally attired. If your audience is dressed smart casual, you should wear a business suit. If your audience is dressed casually, you should dress smart casually, etc. That way you can distinguish yourself from a member of the audience. More recently, I've actually taken to wearing a hat when giving presentations for no purpose other than to distinguish myself from the rest of the audience. Although we all felt in school that it's not good to stand out, if you're trying to become a national or international leader in anything, it is imperative to stand out. Despite the foregoing, also know this: no matter how hard you try, you will still have failures. My most epic failure was to begin a list of 10 important steps to achieve some goal, counting backwards. However, when I reached number 1, the most important step to achieve this important goal, I couldn't remember what it was. Imagine for a moment trying to work your way out of that one. That's the kind of epic failure for which there is no plan B. You will have those kinds of events as well, but remember that failure is not all bad. It has been said that bad publicity, while not as helpful as good publicity, is still better than no publicity at all. As I've already alluded to, one of the characteristics of an accomplished public speaker is that the speaker is memorable and unique. One way to get there is to screw up. Not my most recommended way, but nonetheless, you still learn when making mistakes. It has been said that there are 3 presentations for every single presentation: the one you planned to give, the one you actually gave, and the one in retrospect that you wished you had given. It's best to remember the latter. So, before closing, let's review. You must be a public speaker, an accomplished public speaker, if your goal is to be a national or international leader in your field. In order to be an accomplished public speaker, you must be entertaining, and that will be accomplished in different ways by different people. In order to be entertaining, you must have something to say. And in order to have that something said well, you must refine your thoughts. In doing so, you will master all of the details of a public speaking engagement. And the way you get to master each of those facets of public speaking is to practice, practice, and practice. In his book, The Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell suggests that it takes roughly 10,000 hours of practice to achieve mastery in a field. You must achieve this mastery, so I strongly suggest you get out there and get started. I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Angie, do we have any questions online?
There are no questions at this time.
Okay. If anybody has any questions, they can type them in. I suppose we've got a small group. We could unmute yourself and ask your questions before we let Dr. Mitchell go.
Hello there, it's Davina Banner here from Prince George, BC. Thank you very much for a very engaging and helpful talk. I would be interested to learn more about your approach to questions, in particular, difficult questions that occur after a presentation.
That's an excellent question, for it is very easy to get a difficult question and find that you consume the next 15 minutes trying to answer it. Many speakers do have backup slides that are meant to provide visual aids to trying to answer a question that might be anticipated. I'm not a big fan of them, largely because what it does mean is that you spend 2 or 3 minutes flipping through multiple slides, which do nothing but confuse the audience until you find the slide that is actually addressing the question. I find it's better to have a sufficient mastery of the subject matter that because you know it well, you can answer it simply. I know that's very difficult to do, but as I have suggested earlier in the presentation, you should know more about your topic than the audience that you're speaking to, or you might ask yourself the question, why am I doing this talk?